Hello, this is Mrs. Politsky again, and we are going to start notes for Chapter 11, talking about the Cabinet and some of the other offices of the presidency. So, on your handout, the Cabinet, for the most part, exists of secretaries of roughly 15 different executive departments, and these individuals will help advise the president and lead these departments. There is also the Executive Office of the President, sometimes known as the EOP. These are people that are kind of stationed sometimes within the West Wing of the White House and also outside of that. But they gather information, they develop policy, and they advise the president. So some examples of the EOP, we have the Office of Management and Budget, we have the National Security Council, we have the Council of Economic Advisors, we have other EOP agencies, and we also have our White House office, the staffers that work there. So the EOP consists of the White House and several special agencies that all report directly to the president. The Office of Management and Budget indicates what programs the federal government will pay for and how much they'll spend on each. And the OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget, reviews all legislative proposals by executive agencies, and this review is called a central clearance. It has nothing to do with anything that deals with the CIA. The Congress also created the National Security Council in 1947 to advise the president and help coordinate American military and foreign policy. This kind of had a lot to do with the beginning of the Cold War and kind of the fear of the communists and such. The Special Assistant for National Security Affairs is known as the National Security Advisor, and they direct the National Security Council staff. And finally, the Council of Economic Advisors, they help the president formulate the nation's economic policy. So also within the EOP, we also have what is sometimes known as the inner circle. These are people that kind of work out or work in the West Wing of the White House. And that would include the Chief of Staff, the White House Counsel, Press Secretary and their staff, and the White House staff that works with Congress. Our Chief of Staff, for the most part, this is kind of the person that usually has the president's ear. They gather information, they provide advice on policy and political issues. They also enforce directives from the president. They help decide what information and people will gain or who will gain that access to the president. The White House Counsel, that's a fancy name for the president's attorney, but they advise the president on the legal consequences of their policy decisions. The press secretary and their staff, they handle the president's press relations with the White House press corps. They also set up press conferences, they issue public statements, all in the name of the president. And finally, the White House staff that works with Congress, they work directly with members of Congress. They advise the president about current legislation on Capitol Hill. They lobby lawmakers for certain support of presidential policies. Currently, and not for very long, our Chief of Staff is actually a man named John Kelly. John Kelly will be retiring here within the next few weeks. So he will probably leave the White House around December 31st, 2018. Press Secretary is currently Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Her father was a presidential nominee or presidential person who was campaigning for president back in 2016, Mike Huckabee, and she actually is press secretary of the moment. Section 2, we're going to get into talking about cabinet departments and some of the executive departments that are the big cabinet heads. And I mentioned before there were 15 of these. Agriculture, these are this is the I guess you could say the department that deals with farming, agriculture, and food. And food in this case can mean everything from obviously the food that's being produced by our farmers, but also have the management of that. So hot lunch programs, when we talk about SNAP, which is kind of like the replacement for food stamps, all of that is under the leadership of the Department of Agriculture. Department of Commerce. Commerce is a fancy name for business, but they are looking at the regulations for trade in our country. They also are trying to look at basically legislation that would either help or hinder many of our members or many of our business people throughout the United States. They help manage trademarks. They work a little bit with the uniform standards of weights and measurements. So when you go and pump a gallon of gas, you know it's really a gallon, or if you buy a quart of oil, it's actually a quart of oil. Our Defense Department, they oversee our armed forces and national security. They pretty much, try to protect us. The Department of Education, this department, for the most part, is coordinating federal assistance to programs that are going out to public schools and also private schools. They also make sure that individuals, students who are physically challenged or have limited English proficiency receive assistance. Okay. The Department of Energy, this department, for the most part, plans the energy policy for the United States. They research and develop energy technology. The Health and Human Services, Health and Human Services, for the most part, directs our social services. They're always concerned about public health, Medicare, and the Food and Drug Administration kind of comes under their leadership. Homeland Security, this is the newest of all of our departments. This was formulated right after 9/11, but they now are obviously trying to protect our nation against terrorism. They control the Coast Guard, the Border Patrol, immigration and naturalization. So, when we talk about making sure that illegal immigrants do not come into our country, it's Homeland Security that's kind of dealing with that. They also deal with customs. So as far as like taxes being paid for certain items coming into the United States, they kind of manage that. FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also comes under their leadership as well. Housing and Urban Development, sometimes known by the acronym HUD. They, for the most part, are concerned about housing issues here in the United States. They preserve our nation's communities. They ensure that U.S. citizens have equal opportunity for housing. They oversee government mortgages. So if the government loans money for individuals who qualify for low interest loans for houses, that they will be able to get those. The Department of Interior, this is talking a little bit about the management of our mining in national monuments, national parks, historical site, recreational areas, and also our Native American reservations. The Justice Department, for the most part, the Justice Department is obviously concerned about the legal affairs of our nation, and so they enforce laws. The Department of Labor, they are concerned about our workers and the workplaces that they work at. They try to ensure safe working conditions, minimum wage, protecting our pensions, analyzing employment data, so like the employment rate or unemployment rate, and they regulate unions. The State Department, for the most part, is handling our foreign policy. They staff our embassies. They speak for the United States at the United Nations. The Department of Transportation, they, for the most part, are concerned about mass transit, roads, air travel, and regulating those things. The Department of the Treasury, they are managing the monetary resources of our country. So they serve as kind of the government's financial division. They are operating the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, which is dealing with the printing of our money. They also regulate the Internal Revenue Service, which deals with our income tax, and they regulate alcohol and tobacco and firearms in the United States. And finally, the Department of Veteran Affairs. This administers veterans hospitals and education programs. So when we talk about like the GI Bill, this is something that they are regulating. Our first female cabinet member was Frances Perkins. She happened to be the Secretary of Labor during the FDR administration during the time of the New Deal. Robert Weaver became our first leader of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, and this would have been during Lyndon B. Johnson's administration back in the 60s. And Lauro Cavazio became the Secretary of Education under the Bush administration. That would be H.R. Bush. So, members of George Washington's cabinet were among his closest advisors. Today, cabinet members are ministers of large bureaucracies. Bureaucracies is like big government. And in selecting the department heads, presidents balance political, social, and management considerations. First African American was Robert Weaver, who I mentioned before, who was the head of HUD. And first female was Frances Perkins, who became the Secretary of Labor. And finally, Lauro Cavazio became the Secretary of Education. So when we are selecting cabinet members, some characteristics that most of them have, they're for the most part college graduates, they hold advanced degrees, they're also leaders in their areas of specialty like business, industry, law, education, and science. And as far as their nomination, the president always draws up a list. They consult with campaign advisors and Congress leaders to find the right person. They take that individual and they have them meet with the staffers from the campaign to kind of get a feel for how that individual sees the department that they might be leading. And sometimes presidents will leak the name of this potential nominee to the media so the media can scrutinize them. How are they appointed? The Senate will have a confirmation hearing on these nominees, and the nominee for each department will appear before a Senate committee. The committee members will ask questions about their backgrounds and views, and then eventually committee will give their recommendation. Typically, the Senate will normally cooperate with some of these nominees in the process, but in the modern times, we've seen a little resistance here. Other things that can interfere with cabinet members' usefulness to a president, their conflicting loyalties can be an issue. There's always competition between our cabinet members. They're competing for attention, and sometimes that gets in the way. And then finally, secrecy and trust. Sometimes we have cabinet members that can't be trusted with important details, and hence they may be asked to resign or to leave. All right, thank you very much.